a really good game.
Kind of what the games are pulling on, right?
Talking about historical games, even the idea that a game could be about specific history. And if we're talking about historical games, we're trying to exercise that empathy, and I'm kind of thinking of it in a cognitive way of what did they think, how did they react, what are they seeing, and what do they see as possible. So if we're using this empathy model, speaking to what Paul is talking about, where it's like different things are possible, right? And if we want to really make a good historical game, we have to get into the mind of that person and say, what did that person think was possible? And what does that person want? What are the resources? How do they get it? Et cetera, et cetera. And I think that's where new mechanisms emerge.
Context there. So when we look at these simple games, like Rome versus barbarians, it's really not that simple. And I would also point out that the barbarians don't see themselves as barbarians. Like, people don't look at themselves and think, I'm a barbarian. It's more of a matter of what Jason likes to talk about, which is agency. Like, who gets agency? And also, why is our analogy about the survival of Roman thoughts until we can, like, have a renaissance and then have modern times dependent on dealing with the icky barbarians trying to come and take Rome? Like, I think it's that particular linkage, right, that's really interesting. It's like, can you link our future interest in the classics to something else? Or are we forever kind of anchored by the stories that Rome tells us?
We don't do things the same way solely because they touch the ideological nerves that we need them to touch, but also because in terms of the cognitive load that you're asking somebody to undertake when you build a game, convention is an easy way in, like whether it's superhero movies or board games.
So I asked them what they thought about that game, and they were like, well, it's more sort of true to our history in some sense, but it's so sad that this is how we are being represented as a problem, as someone who is just, in constant warfare and so on, because that's not our life experience.
Like, the games don't expect us or need us to know anything about Rome. They're kind of offering a knowledge about Rome. Whether it's good or bad knowledge or effective or not is another question. But when you think about that notion that in order for a game about ancient Rome to make sense for us, it must traffic in these categories of understanding that are familiar to us.
But overall, the way that the island gets set up, as you're playing it and you're building these canals and you're establishing these districts, is what happens, right? And so you can actually come away from it going, oh, that was an interesting game. And if you ask the question of, is this how Tenochtitlan got set up, was through people building these canals and then building pyramids, the answer is yes. Yes, it is.
I'm thinking of it as an educator, right? I want to use this in the classroom. I try to get the students to understand how could a band of Spaniards, very small, sort of contribute to the downfall of Tenochtitlan, right, of the city. One of the explanations we give is that there was a certain political fragility to the way that the Tlatoanis were sharing power with the emperor, right? So this is kind of removed from that, but you get a sense of how that clan-based kind of like claiming of space created these rivalries that made the empire itself kind of fragile once and outside the right?
We have more access to that humanity, we have more access to those stories, and if more people can kind of like internalize that, like those are people, and those are people like you and me. I want to know their story. I think that we're not going to get the gaming change that we want until we get that larger cultural change, and it's dialectic. So like maybe, and this is where it's like, I don't have a lot of hope, but I have a lot of fight. And I'm going to fight with publishers, and I'm going to fight with people who are the gatekeepers until I can get my games, my property, the things that I think center marginalized people into this space. Maybe that cues in enough people, oh wow, human story. I want to know more human stories. And that is the way that change happens. I don't know if it's like we can make it sound like an easy process, right? More games and enough critical mass to know, well, we're going to have this. I think there's more of a struggle and a dialectic that has to happen.
It takes as long to do a really good game as it does to do a really good book. And And they looked at me and they're like, but it's just a game. It's like, yeah, but you need to make sure everything's flowing together. And so many of the family games that we do still take time, still take effort, but if what you're doing is creating good mechanics and then slapping on theme, it takes less time. If you want that theme really embedded in there, it's harder. If you're familiar with the theme because what you've been steeped in is Western greatness for years and decades, then you've already got that familiarity that makes you comfortable.
My general attitude about games in the present moment is that a game can never be too soon to do a game on a subject, only too late. So I'm always really happy to see games try to tackle the modern moment. But you get moments where someone takes a risk, and then a whole game tradition can flower out of that. And so I, on the publisher side, on the economic side, I'm always interested in the barriers to those risks. And this is another, I'm going to be the optimist here. This is another place where hoping is actually those barriers have never been as low as they are. In terms of what it takes to produce 20 games or 50, they just have never been remotely as low. I would much rather start a fledgling board game company than a fledgling book publisher or music publisher.
And then also, what would games look like if they gave barbarians their due as like real people with real historical roles who are real actors in the story? And like, how would that change what we're playing if we built our games to honor that?
What about the games that actually resonate? What about the games in the quote-unquote mass market? And that's a very difficult thing to define, something we need to define, but there is one. And that is the games that resonate, the games that people play.
There's this tension, right, between the better you want the history to be, it seems like the more complicated the game has to be, which means the less accessible it has to be. So the better you want to teach the history, the harder it is.
It's even the idea that a game could be about specific history, I think, is it's very closely tied to, two traditions, I think, a pedagogic tradition.
Yeah.
And then also in contemporary sense, this idea of using a game to model something.
Yeah.
Right? So I think about this like as the tradition of the match of happiness that you produce, this weird pedagogic tradition, and then also the idea that the games were to model something.
Yeah.
And of course, those are deeply connected, I think, fundamentally like the 19th and 20th.
Yeah, that's right.
So if we were to tell the story of the Lewis and Clark expedition, well, what do we owe the people who helped Lewis and Clark along the way? If we were to tell more indigenous stories, even just focusing on the West, well then, there's this annoying thing called the Treaty of Fort Laramie, which promises the where Mount Rushmore is, the Black Hills, to those tribes. So like, at the end of the day, the end of that story of telling more indigenous stories is give their shit back. Give their mountains back, give their bodies back, give their wealth back, or some kind of like sharing mechanism, some kind of what the culture calls reparation. And there's so much at the power level, and there's so much at the middle educated level that feels too invested in what it has in order to truly allow those stories to escape the margins, is my kind of theorizing of it.